It rained most of this week, so things were pretty slow out in the field. Separate and aside from that, things have just not been going my way this week. I have editing platforms going haywire. I made a few rather egregious errors, some screw ups, some long labored over grant proposals that almost didn't get submitted. I might as well have woken up with gum in my hair. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong this week. In other news, you might have seen this story about how the Trump administration awarded a no-bid contract to make repairs on the reflecting pool that sits between the Lincoln Memorial and Washington Monument in D.C. And that contract is not going well. Everybody has their own take on this, I am sure. But the thing that really stood out to me was that no-bid contract. Oof. Now, I guess they justified this as an emergency situation to get those repairs made before the 250th anniversary, which that really has me laughing, referring to, any one of my personal preferences or wants and desires as an emergency. A smash cut to me leaned over a bakery case pointing at a donut and insisting it's an emergency situation. However, as somebody with a lot of experience as a government contractor, both contracted directly and indirectly, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about how it's supposed to work. These are our tax dollars after all, so you should know that there is typically some thought put into this, and as messy and convoluted as the system is, it usually works. Also, working through this could help me work through some of my own stuff, my own trials and tribulations from this week. So it is very hard for us to wrap our heads around how big our country is, both geographically as well as the size of our federal government. It is huge. I don't think our lizard brains can really comprehend it. Some of these processes might sound pretty ridiculous, pretty slow and convoluted. There's plenty of examples where things get really screwy, and there's certainly space for fraud and abuse, but they're rare. At the end of the day, it actually makes a lot of sense, and it works as well as you might think it would be. So the General Services Administration, or the GSA, acts as the government's central purchasing office. So they streamline the way that the federal government will spend our tax dollars. When I was an actual employee of the federal government as a research scientist for the USDA, I took part in purchasing equipment with the GSA's help. So the GSA maintains a list of vendors. They're businesses that undergo a very rigorous vetting process to prove that they are a reliable partner with fair pricing. There's a few requirements for those as well for cybersecurity. That's just because there's so much of our data that's stored with vendors that they have to promise to do certain things to keep the government's information safe from foreign actors on the WWW, right? So that's a new thing. But in general, we would go to that list of vendors for our day-to-day purchases. So certain dollar values, as long as it was a reliable vendor, we could use them and use a credit card to buy day-to-day purchases. For bigger purchases, higher dollar value, some more specific things. Like, for example, I purchased a set of growth chambers I needed for very specialized work investigating winter biology in insects. I needed to work with the GSA to describe my very specialized needs, and that was posted on the GSA's website as, hey, this is a need for vendors. So even though I had already worked with the one company in the world that supplies this type of equipment, before that, it still needed to go on that GSA website and be open to the public. So other people technically could have bid for that contract, even if they didn't have the exact same product. If they could come up with something that was really close to my need, they could put in a bid through the GSA. For more generic goods and services, like, hiring somebody to paint the bottom of the reflecting pool, that process would take quite a bit longer. You'd have that open to the public for maybe months so that you could have multiple people submitting proposals to prove that they're the most capable, they can do it at the most reasonable price. In my case, the GSA actually did a little bit of market analysis, went out there to see what kind of companies offered the kind of equipment I was looking for, and they did streamline the process. So they made that window a little bit shorter, and I was able to go with the company that I wanted to go with because they're the only ones who supply that piece of equipment. This process did take a little bit longer than just calling up this company and giving them a credit card, but it was a very good reason, right? Big purchases should have some thought. There should be a process. And also, the people who work with me at GSA were awesome. Like, they were very helpful in explaining the process to me. Like, probably the millionth time that week, they had to explain the process to some new person because they work for every government agency, not just weirdos like me. And they were available by phone. And I kind of wonder how available they are nowadays because there are so many cuts in staffing at all these agencies. So, like, let's say a little prayer for their mental health right now because they're probably dealing with a lot of very grouchy people who are having a hard time doing their job because they can't buy anything. Leave that there. But I really want to hold on tightly to this notion that our country, our federal government, no matter how big and how ridiculous it is, we are capable of doing some really big and amazing things. I might have a higher threshold for pain when it comes to bureaucracy. And I think that might be because I have a little bit more experience doing it, but it might be because I ascribe to ancient Stoic thinking, the philosophy of amor fati, love of your fate. Those of you with a military background might recognize this as embrace the suck. But I would add to that a little bit because I think falling in love with your fate isn't just a matter of accepting your situation. It's not just a matter of embracing the suck because there's nothing else you can do with it. It's becoming infatuated with your fate and deeply curious. I will give you an example because, you could encounter barriers anywhere in life and throw up your hands and say, never again, it's not worth it. Or you could get curious and learn more about the process. Most things have a reason. Most of the time you can get a nice person on the phone to answer your questions, explain those reasons, and everything usually has a way of working out in the end, and I'm sure we can learn something along the way. One of my many screw-ups of the week involved a grant proposal that I'm submitting in collaboration with the Maine Organic Gardeners and Farmers Association. We call it MOFGA. So we're hoping to partner on a project for the Organic Agricultural Research and Extension Initiative, or OREI. This is one of many programs run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that essentially contracts out work that helps them carry out their mission. That mission is to make sure that our food system is as safe as possible, that our farmers and ranchers and foresters are doing the absolute best job they can do to provide us with food and other agricultural products. This particular program is meant to support organic growers. So it makes sense I'm partnering with MOFGA there. We're not technically vendors, we're contractors, but we still have to provide the government with information about our organizations that proves that we're reliable partners. These grants are usually submitted by much larger institutions than some lady who just started a nonprofit, but they're technically open to pretty much anybody who can prove that they're a reliable partner. Many of us remember the free money guy. Remember him? Well, I believe his book provided some instructions on how you could get yourself registered on sites like SAM.gov, on grants.gov, so you can get those credentials that you submit along with your grant proposals to prove that you are legit. So this is something I've been working on for NHCSR, getting NHCSR registered in all the right places, and it is pretty easy to sign up to get your UEI, that's the unique entity identifier assigned by SAM.gov. Getting registered is a little bit trickier than just getting that number because I hadn't yet filled out my tax return for that year. It was too early in the process. I was a brand new nonprofit, but eventually I got my tax return submitted. That's actually pretty easy for small dollar nonprofits. However, it didn't match perfectly. So I ran into some problems there, but I talked to a very nice lady at the IRS who helped me figure it out. She solved that problem for me. I thanked her for her service, and if we're going to do it for GSA, we should certainly say a little prayer for their mental health at IRS right now. So we were very proud of ourselves for getting this grant proposal submitted to the OREI program almost a week ahead of the deadline. So proud. However, it was rejected because my organization was missing its ERA Commons ID. I didn't know what that was. Apparently, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is currently updating their methods of tracking potential contractors, and that required me to register with the National Institute of Health, which I did. However, that process requires an actual human to review it, so it takes more than a few days, especially coming from a new entity like NHCSR. I spoke to a very nice lady at the NIH, and Lord knows they need a little prayer at NIH right now. She explained the process could take up to 10 days. So we would have missed that deadline for submitting the grant proposal, which that would be a real kick in the teeth. I spent time writing that proposal, but moreover, I requested letters of support from a ton of people whose time and expertise I respect greatly, and it would have been really tough to not make that deadline. However, we reached out to the people at the OREI project, and they found a solution for us, which we quickly adopted. What a team over there. So we got the proposal submitted. Everything worked out. Nobody panicked. Everybody was lovely and helpful, especially Ryan Dennett and Caleb Goosen at MOFGA. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much, you guys. You guys are the best. So yes, it is buck wild to find out at the last minute that I need to register with the National Institutes of Health in order to submit a grant proposal to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Yes, that is sucky. That is not good. You know I have some choice words for the people in charge over there. But look at all these lovely government employees that were so helpful along the way. You know, they're there to answer the phone, help me figure it out, to carry out the mission at hand, which is doing all these amazing things that this ridiculous behemoth of a federal government can do. It's messy, but at the end of the day, it is kind of amazing. And this is what I mean by falling in love with your fate. It's not accepting the way things look on the outside. It's not accepting the suckiness just because you have no other choice, but it means poking and prodding and being curious and finding out how to work through these barriers. Just exceptional curiosity. So hopefully things will get better next week. I will see them.